Hello, my name is Dr. Sara Read, and I'm a lecturer in English in the School for Social Science and Humanities at Loughborough University. I'd like to thank the Master and all at Darwin College for inviting me to participate in this year's lecture series. This year's theme of blood looks to have made for an exciting and stimulating series. I'm a literary historian, and my expertise is in the cultural and literary representations of the reproductive female body in early modern England. My lecture this evening draws upon this research and will outline the ways in which early modern people described and related to menstruation and other occasions of female reproductive bleeding, from adolescence to menopause. I'll be outlining the main medical discussions of the day as they attempted to rationalise why the female body was subject to a monthly discharge of blood and what the significance of menarche, hymenal and postpartum bleeding was in the 17th and early 18th centuries.
Good evening and welcome to the second lecture in the 2021 Darwin College Lecture Series. As many of you know, this series of talks is one of Darwin College's key contributions to addressing globally important topics in a multidisciplinary way. We believe such an approach is both stimulating and rewarding for our audience, a community that is becoming more and more global as we share the lectures virtually online. We're sad, of course, not to have a live audience here in Lady Mitchell Hall, but grateful to so many of you who've joined us online live instead today. Last week's lecture has already had over 1,000 people viewing it, far more than would have had the opportunity to view it here in Cambridge. We owe much gratitude to our speakers, of course, who've made time to record their lectures during lockdown with all the challenges that entails. Recording speakers in this way is new for the college, as well as several of our guest lecturers, so please excuse any reduction in quality that results from this. The lectures will remain online, so please do share the details of our YouTube channel with anyone you think might enjoy tonight's talk. As you know, the theme for this year's series is blood, a vital body fluid with a unique biology and a major place in our history, culture and mythology. Last week, we began the lecture series with a wonderful presentation by Claire Roddy, a consultant haematologist at University College London. Claire vividly described to us her work in developing and trialling novel therapies for blood cancer, with examples of the enormous scientific, emotional and practical challenges that go with treating a complex and devastating illness like that. Unbeknown to our audience, Claire had to break off mid-sentence while recording her talk to take an emergency call from the ward. But she calmly returned to her laptop and continued to deliver her lecture. And our skillful editorial team were able to fill in the gap so that I hope the audience were unaware of the minor crisis that we had. Tonight, it's a great pleasure to introduce our second speaker on blood, Dr. Sara Read. She's a literary historian and a lecturer in English at Loughborough University here in the UK. Sara is a specialist in early modern culture, literature and medicine, with a focus on women's reproductive health. She's also a novelist, having turned her research into a work of historical fiction. Her lecture today is entitled Transitional Bleeding in Early Modern England.
So what do I mean by the phrase transitional bleeding in my title? Well, in early modern England, each new episode of vaginal bleeding was imbued with meaning which related not just to the physiological changes they announced in the female body, but in cultural and social terms too. This was because each type of bleeding, from menarche to postpartum bleeding, marked a change in the way the woman was perceived both by herself and by those around her. Professor Helen King has shown that the Hippocratic texts, which inform much of early modern medical theory and practice, portrayed the process of growing from a girl to a woman as being a gradual one. King explains that on-generation indicates that as a girl grows, the channels in her body are opened to make a way through and a way outside. Therefore, as part of her growth to maturity, all three transitional bleedings, menarche, defloration and childbirth, cause further changes in the body. And what we find by studying medical discourse alongside other more traditionally literary texts in the early modern era is that this model holds true then too. The onset of menstruation marked a girl's transition to young womanhood, and postpartum bleeding signified a change to motherhood. Medical debates about why women should expect to bleed at all were heated in early modern England. So this lecture will outline the most common medical theories, describe the many words and circumlocutions early moderns used to describe menstruation, and discuss the prevailing cultural expectations of this event too. The physiology of menstruation might be timeless, but the experience of female reproductive bleeding from menarche to menopause is mediated through different cultural norms at any given time. So, for example, when people ask me why did I study menstruation and female reproductive bleeding in the early modern era, was it different then? I answer, well, not in terms of the physiology, but in the way that physiology and those changes to the body were understood, experienced, and interpreted. As the late Roy Porter has noted, to a large degree our sense of our bodies and what happens in and to them is not first-hand, but mediated through maps and expectations derived from the culture at large. And of course, this is a two-way process, whereby cultural norms inform understandings of the way a person assumes their body to function. And these understandings are reflected back into cultural, literary and other outputs. So the early modern era was one which predominantly saw the body as a humoral one, in which blood was one of the four main humours. And men and women's bodies, as you can see on the image on screen, were perceived to be different, having a different humoral balance and different humoral constitution from one another. And in terms of differences, one of the main ones was that unlike modern medical assumptions, the Hippocratic taxonomy, as understood in the early modern period, considered that all aspects of vaginal bleeding, including the blood lost at first intercourse and that lost after childbirth, were directly related to menstruation, and that menstrual blood was what was being lost on these occasions. I should really briefly point out here that a key term I'm using, menarche, is not a term that had any currency in the early modern period. Indeed, it's not a term that's lost in the Oxford English Dictionary until 1900. Instead, the event was simply referred to descriptively as the time a girl could expect her first menstrual period. And speaking of language and different terminology, pausing here to review the most common early modern names for menstruation at the outset will make what follows clearer. There existed very many euphemisms, circumlocutions, and just alternative names for menstruation in this era. The most common and oldest of these was flowers. And it comes from a horticultural metaphor that without flowers there can be no fruit. The next most common names were terms or courses, and these names emphasise the periodic nature of the flow. For most of the 17th century, medics preferred to use menses, from the Latin for monthlies, or use purgations. From the late 17th century, in line with a general move away from Latin amongst scholars, the medical corpus starts to prefer words based on Greek instead, and so medics start to use the word catamenia instead of menses. Interestingly, the most normal formal word for periods nowadays, menstruation, is recorded in the OED from 1754, but my research has been able to antedate this by nearly 70 years and show that it was in fact present in medical texts in the 17th century. So from 1686, Gideon Harvey published a conclave of physicians, which is a debate amongst physicians about the appropriate treatment for a woman who's having problems related to her menstrual cycle. And Harley makes it clear that I am referring to a case of menstruation. Other euphemisms were more personal to the women involved. So, for example, Queen Anne exchanged correspondence with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and they talk about Lady Charlotte's visits. Other women use even more vague euphemisms like those. The idea that the onset of menstruation is a mark of change in a woman's condition, of course, is one that still holds true for many women today. but there are no records that I've been able to find yet. I'm still hopeful. Recording menarche in diaries or letters from the early modern period. Perhaps one day. But it's important to note that in this era, while the change was a significant one, and one that even held that the girl was now marriageable, it's not the case that she was thought fully mature, and instead her life stage was seen more as adolescence continuing for a number of years. According to the theory of the 7 ages of man, one of several similar models for life cycles that was current at the time, and it's the one, for example, that we see in William Shakespeare's As You Like It, when Jaques famously says, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. One man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in his nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like a snail, unwillingly to school, and then the lover, sighing like furnace with a woeful ballad made to his mistress's eyebrow." Now, Jaques begins by talking about men and women, but then describes a male life cycle. But the same stages and gradual approach to maturity is true of women in this era too. And so, while menarche might mark the moment a girl transitioned to womanhood, her maturation process would continue, and part of that, of course, is exploring her sexuality and sexual urges as part of this growth to the next stage of her life. One of the texts that it's useful to turn to illustrate this is the anonymously published Aristotle's masterpiece, which was published first in 1684 and then came out in multiple editions right until the 20th century. And this text says, "The propension and inclination of maids to marry is to be discovered by many symptoms, as when nature fringes the obscure parts and their terms flow at the time appointed, which is usually in the 14th or 15th year of their age, when as the seed increaseth in some sooner and others later, according to their habits or constitutions, and the blood which is no longer taken to augment their bodies abounding incites their minds and imaginations to venery," which suggests that just as boys in their third era or third age dreamt of love and lovers, so do girls. And part of the physical changes which signify this are the onset of menstruation. The text says, when they begin to be in love and desirous of copulation, and also their short breathings, tremblings, and pantings of their heart. And it's not just in medical and pseudo-medical discourse that the idea of a young woman would be menstruating and now capable of reproduction, and so her thoughts would turn to love and sex by the age of 14. It has a cultural significance that is seen in plays like Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. Antigonus says, "I have 3 daughters. The eldest is 11, the second and the third 9, some 5. If this prove true, they'll pay for it. By mine honour, I'll geld 'em all. 14 they shall not see, to bring false generation. They are co-heirs, and I had rather glib myself than they should not produce fair issue." Another of the reasons that this idea is so embedded culturally is that it fitted with another theory, that the belief that each 7-year anniversary was a moment of potential crisis in the body. Author of the Midwife's book, published in 1671, Jane Sharp, explained that every climactical or 7 years breeding a new alteration in the body of man. Children cast their teeth at 7, and maids' courses begin to flow at 14. 7 times 7 is the great danger to man's life, and the great climactical, which few escape, is 7 times 9, which makes 63. So what we've seen so far is that reaching menarche, for which the age 14 stands as a cultural signifier, was the one at which a girl transitioned into young womanhood in early modern society. And indeed, one of the conduct books says that at age 14 is when a girl acquires the title of mistress and is seen as a young woman. After menarche then, the norm was that a young woman would experience several years of menstrual cycles. And it seems likely that in the main, women, young or old, would largely disinclined to write about their cycles, despite the existence, as we've seen, of the many, often quite vague, euphemisms for menstruation that existed at this time. In a recent discovery, my research student, Katie Woodhouse-Skinner, who has conducted extensive archival research for adolescent girls' writings, has recently discovered a pocketbook of Frances Snaith, who marks an X each month for over 12 months, which regularly seems to imply that this is her menstrual cycle. So discoveries are being made all the time, and hopefully more will come out in due course. As rare as it is, though, to see such notation, it could be that women more broadly did mark their almanacs or other records this way, but these private writings just haven't survived. Certainly, the author of the midwife's book, Jane Sharp, laments that young women, especially of their first child, are so ignorant commonly that they cannot tell whether they have conceived or not, and not 1 in 20 almost keeps a just account, else they would be better provided against the time of their lying in, and not so suddenly surprised as many of them are. She laments that young women don't keep a record of their periods, because if they did, they'd have a better idea of when they conceived, and therefore when their baby was due, and not be surprised by the onset of labour, as she says many are. And this comment then might allow the reader to infer that older women either did keep proper records, or that they had a better sense of their own menstrual cycle and their own body. But it has been possible to map out some women's menstrual cycles from their writings, mainly from those who've had problematical experiences, and these tend to be women from the upper ranks. So, for example, Lady Margaret Hobby and Brilliana Lady Harley both make entries in their diaries and their letters which seem to be implying that they were having trouble with their menstrual cycles and needed to seek the help of a physician. While women didn't seem to want to record their cycles to any great extent, even within their private diaries, unless they were ill, husbands didn't seem to feel the same, and there are a number of cases of men routinely noting down their wife's menstrual periods. John Dee even makes discursive comments about the nature of his wife's bleeding, describing how Jane hath them a little or a lot, depending on how heavy he judged her bleeding to be. Diarist Samuel Pepys is famous for recording his wife's terribly painful periods, and records several times when she was quite poorly. Indeed, his very first diary entry, which you can see on the screen, noted that Elizabeth and he had hopes that she might be pregnant, but after the return of her terms, after 7 weeks, their hopes ended. Despite the fact that the Pepys had a stormy marriage, and that there are actually some quite touching moments, such as when she sends him a note at work to say that she's not very well, and he comes home from the office to sit with her. Frustratingly, Pepys doesn't record what steps Elizabeth took to manage her symptoms, but they would probably focus on purges such as laxatives and emetics, as rebalancing the humours was thought key to erasing painful periods or dysmenorrhea at this time. Nowadays, menstruation is seen as the loss of the womb lining and blood and other matters, but in the past, menstruation was thought to be made up of blood lost from the veins of the womb. It did carry corruption, as they called it, with it, but the main body of menstruation was straight from menstrual veins. There were 3 main theories which offered reasons why a woman experienced a monthly bleed at all. Claude Galen, writing in the 2nd century, suggested that it was necessary for women to bleed each month because they led sedentary lives, and so built up an excess of blood. This didn't happen to men, Galen said, because they worked harder and had more physical jobs, and so sweated out their excess humours. Galen's views, which were informed by the Hippocratic corpus, of course, prevailed until this era. And so when Hilkiah Cook wrote in 1615 that women were known to spend their days sitting and embroidery, or as he puts it, pricking on a clout, he was following in their examples. This sitting around meant that over the month, an excess of blood built up in women's bodies that needed to be discharged as the body rebalanced itself. This explanation for menstruation was known as the plethora theory, and was the most common explanation for why women experience monthly bleeding at this time. As just mentioned, a great importance was placed on evacuation in the early modern period under the humoral idea. Physicians regularly prescribed medicines to make their patients sick or go to the toilet, and then gleefully recorded how many times the patient had to go to stool as after their treatment. And this was because all evacuations were thought to be one of the environmental or external factors in maintaining health. This is to say that it was getting unnecessary matter out of the body, which is one of the elements that we call the non-naturals, which Galen describes as the 6 external factors, the ones come from without the body that can help or hinder good health, and they include air, sleep, intake of food and drink, evacuations, which include sexual emissions, movement or exercise, and emotions or passions. In this context, then, it's easy to see why maintaining a regular period was so important to early modern women and their physicians. There were 2 other theories put forward about why women had periods, and they were known as the ferment theory and the lunar theory. The latter quite straightforwardly held that the action of the moon caused women to bleed on a monthly basis. And while this theory was put forward in print as recently as the 1970s, early modern medical writers often dismissed the theory, suggesting that, well, if it was true, then surely all women would have their menstrual period on the same day because the moon would be in the same cycle for everybody. This said, though, most medics did think that the moon had some influence on women's cycles, and that younger women were more likely to bleed at the rising moon and older ones as it waned. Ferment theory was only fashionable for a few decades. It held that, much like the fermenting of alcohol, as you can see on the screen, somewhere in the female body a ferment brewed until it reached a critical point and then bleeding broke out. And this process then would continue on a cycle each month. The site where this might have happened was never found, although one doctor, James Drake, claimed in 1707 that this was what the gallbladder was for. But because there wasn't a site agreed or found in any sort of consensus, this theory died out by the mid-18th century. The second of the transitional bleedings that the female body was thought to undergo in this era traditionally happened on their wedding night, when a maid became a wife. The blood lost on first intercourse is arguably imbued with more cultural significance than the other occasions that I discuss. So before I talk about that, it's important that we understand the way that the vagina and its anatomy was understood in this era. One text, called a Bartholinius Anatomy, writes, "In the bottom of the womb we have observed 3 things, the bottom itself, the lesser neck, and the orifice. In the greater neck also 3 things are to be noted, the neck itself, the hymen, and the mouth of the bladder." The neck here is the vagina. Neck was a common term for vagina in this era. The term vagina appears in print at the start of the 17th century, but isn't one that's widely used in medical texts until the end of the 17th century. From the 1780s onwards, you see it more. The blood supply in this area is explained by Helkiah Crook in 1615, who wrote, "There are 2 veins which disperse their branches through the womb, some of which are carried to the inward cavity thereof, by which the infant is nourished. Others run to the outward part of the womb, even unto the neck and the lap itself." This understanding of female anatomy is further exemplified in the mid-17th century by the author of The Complete Midwife's Practice, who states that the reason there are so many veins in the vagina is that the flowers, as we now know that's menstrual periods, the flowers must not only come out of the womb, but also from the neck of the womb also. So she's saying that, this author is saying that menstrual blood doesn't just come from the womb, but it comes from the vagina, and the same veins that feed the womb feed the vagina too. The neck of the womb also can mean the cervix, as it tends to do nowadays, but also here it means vagina. For many medics consider that the blood from the veins of the vagina were stretched, and this stretching broke the vessels, and that's what caused this discharge of blood on the wedding night. In 1682, Thomas Gibson explained that In virgins, its duct is so straight that at their first congress with a man, they have commonly more pain than pleasure through the extension of it by the penis, whereby some small vessels break out of which blood issues as of a slain victim. By its duct, which is a synonym for passage, Gibson here is referring to the vagina. This last remark also clarifies that this blood was seen as a form of menstrual bleeding, since as far back as the Hippocratic Corpus, healthy menstrual blood was described as looking like the blood of a sacrificial victim. This connection is why intercourse, for example, was thought to be an unbeatable cure for the green sickness, the virgin's disease, which is a disease characterized by a lack of menstruation in young women. Sara Read explained this connection by saying that experience teacheth that sometimes these women, the ones with green sickness, have their terms the first night after marriage, and that others who are in good health have them before their accustomed time. So what he's suggesting is that once the vaginal veins opened, they can go on to help discharge a full menstrual period. So women who had green sickness or who have very scant or very infrequent menstruation cycles could become regular and experience normal menstruation after they've had first intercourse and after the vaginal veins have been stretched by the penis. That intercourse caused the vessels to open and bleed is the explanation behind a piece of gossip that Samuel Pepys recorded in 1666, which was put out to provide a cover for one of the Duke of York's many affairs. This entry in his diary states that Sir Richard Ford did this evening at Sir W. Batten's tell us that upon opening the body of my Lady Denham, it is said that they found a vessel about her matrix which had never been broke by her husband, and that it caused all pains of her body, which, if true, is an excellent invention to clear both the Duchess from poison and the Duke from lying with her. Lady Margaret Denham had been married the previous year, when she was 23, to the 50-year-old, apparently impotent Lord John Denham. The ruse that she died a virgin of a complication caused by a blocked vessel, perhaps envisaged as a form of green sickness, was put about to remove the supposition that she had been poisoned for being a favourite mistress who held too much sway with the Duke of York. But that this story could spread plausibly succinctly demonstrates that there is a widespread acceptance that the vessels in the vagina did contribute to the bleeding women experienced on their wedding night. Some commentators, though, added that they thought this blood might emanate from more than one source, as Thomas Gibson's comment that we had a minute ago ends when he says that he supposes the blood does come from the vaginal vessels. He says, unless we should rather think the blood proceeds from the rupture of the hymen. The hymen was described by Gibson like this. It's a thin, nervous membrane interwoven with carnous fibres and endowed with many little arteries and veins spread across the duct of the vagina behind the insertion of the neck of the bladder, with a little hole in the middle that will admit the top of one's little finger by which the menses flow. This description of the intact hymen being big enough to admit a man's finger is fairly consistent in this period. Descriptions of the hymen normally compare it to a flower, often a carnation. Crook's account is fairly typical, that he says that it looks like the cup of a rose half blown, with the bearded leaves taken away, or the great clove gillyflower when it is moderately in bloom. Jane Sharp echoes this description almost word for word, but then elaborates to explain that from thence came the term deflowered. However, the very existence or not of the hymen was also heavily theorised in this era, which is one of the reasons why there was a need for an alternative explanation for the issue of this blood. The volume of blood lost, or expected to be lost at this time, were often varied in different books. According to medical understandings, the amount of blood loss could vary from merely a smear to life-threatening amounts. Isbrand van Dijmerbroek recalled the death of one of his patients on her wedding night from a hemorrhage. He wrote, I remember that I knew a young bride in Upper Bathia to whom, by the violent emission of the yard in the first act of coition, and the sudden dilation of the vagina, there happened such a prodigious flux of blood that in 3 hours she lost her life, together with her virginity. And the like unfortunate accident some years ago befell the daughter of a certain citizen of Utrecht, who was so wounded that first night that before morning, the flux of blood not being stopped, she expired. The fact that this blood attracted so much attention in the medical text is largely because of its unique theoretical importance, not only in acting as proof positive of virginity on marriage, but also because it was this second occasion of bleeding, this second transition, the one that followed menarche, which formed part of a woman's growth to maturity. And it's another one of the instabilities of the significance of this blood, however, because almost all medical texts take pains to offer reasons why a woman might not bleed on her wedding night on first intercourse, which included that if she had heavy periods, they may have eroded the hymen. If you recall, I said the menstrual blood was thought to carry certain corrupt humours with it out of the body. And if a woman experienced that, then they could have eroded the hymen or indeed loosened the vaginal passages themselves. Given that very many women were not virgins on marriage, and indeed between a fifth and a third of them, researchers have found, were pregnant at their marriage, which of course includes William Shakespeare and his bride Anne Hathaway, the expectation that of a thing that carried great cultural significance was something that might prove elusive at the required moment, so it needed to be explained away plausibly. Additionally, while its appearance was proof of virginity then, its absence didn't disprove the same. Following the lead of ancient Greek physicians in the early modern period, it was considered necessary for a girl to lose her virginity for her to become fully a woman. And the loss of blood was proof this transition had happened, and so was therefore thought desirable. After marriage, pregnancy was expected to follow. And while I haven't located any instances yet of a woman recording her personal experiences of hymenal bleeding, women did sometimes discuss their experience of postpartum bleeding, which was also considered to be an occasion of menstrual bleeding in this era. And the image you can see at the bottom on screen from Jane Sharp's book shows the flower over her private parts, and this flower imagery is linking back, of course, to the flowers that lead to fruitfulness, which make a woman fertile, and you see it all over in the 17th century. Lockyer, the term that we use for postpartum bleeding nowadays, was a term that was naturalised into English in the early 17th century, but you don't really see it outside of elite medical writers. Women authors, such as Jane Sharp, don't use Lockyer at all. Jane Sharp prefers purgations or menstrual blood. And another midwife who wrote her memoir in 1737, Sarah Stone, doesn't refer to Lockyer either. She talks about floodings, for example, or cleanings. And she has lots of examples in her cases that she discusses in this memoir of women who had problems with their menses throughout their pregnancies. Sarah Stone claimed to have a secret method to stem this bleeding when it was thought detrimental to the continuation of a pregnancy. And she says it never failed her. And often she was called in as a consultant in difficult labours when all else had failed, including when the intervention of physicians or male surgeons had failed. And she says that in minutes she can stop this bleeding and therefore save the woman's life and often the child's life too. But she doesn't tell her reader what this secret method for stemming bleeding is in her text, because she's got her daughter who's followed in her footsteps and is now a midwife to think of. So she says, it is a secret I would have willingly made known, but for the benefit of my sisters in the profession, but for the sake of my daughter who practiced the same art these 10 years. With as good success as myself, I shall leave it in her power to make it known. So she says she'll leave it up to her daughter if her daughter feels it's appropriate to tell the secret to a wider audience. As we saw in the quote from Halkaya Crook earlier on in this lecture, it was widely believed in the 17th century that the baby in the uterus was nourished by menstrual blood. And this was why women sometimes had bleeding resembling menstrual periods in early pregnancy. The fetus simply couldn't consume all the blood that would normally be lost on a period when it was very tiny. And then later on in pregnancy, it was widely thought that the fetus would take the choicest part of the blood and discard the rest. This stored menstrual blood that built up over 9 months in the mother's womb was what was thought to be discharged after the birth. And the length of the time that a woman might bleed for after she's given birth was calculated as being the same length of time in the days that she's missed periods during her pregnancy. Jacques Guillemot, the French physician, estimated that if a woman should have bled for 3 or 4 days every month for 9 months, that equates to 27 or 36 days of postpartum bleeding or lochial bleeding. Yorkshire gentlewoman AliceThornton wrote about her postpartum bleeding in her autobiography. She referred to her lochial flow as those, and the heavy bleeding she experiences after some pregnancies as floodings. After the birth of her daughter Betty, Thornton described how she was at death's door by the extreme excess of those. Upon the fright and terror that came upon me, so great floods that I was spent, and my breath lost, my strength departed me, and I could not speak for faintings. However, Thornton's frankness is extremely untypical. Thornton was an exceptional woman, writing in specific circumstances to vindicate her life, but her writing offers an insight into the way that women might have routinely talked to their midwife when they discussed their lochial flow, or to their companions who had helped them through their labour. In this era, it was customary for women to remain in their bed, rising incrementally, beginning with sitting up, or which was called upsitting, after a day or two, going on to potter about her chamber before being able to resume her normal activities after a month. This period in a woman's life is often referred to, therefore, as the woman's month, an expectation that she would have a recovery period from the ordeal of labour and her body would have a chance to heal. And it's one of the reasons we can go back to The Winter's Tale and think about Hermione at her trial. And she says that it's an outrage that she's been put on trial so soon after giving birth and hasn't been able to complete her lying in. She says, proclaimed a strumpet, and with immodest hatred, the childbed privilege denied which longs to all women of fashion. So she's saying that it's outrageous that she's not even recovered from childbirth and she's standing before the court having to argue for her innocence. And she's right to suggest that this was a privilege women of fashion were due, because while it was a recommendation for all women to take a period of rest after giving birth, for families who were economically dependent on a woman's labour, they wouldn't have the luxury of staying in bed for a month. And indeed, Sarah Stone has a few examples in her case notes of laundry maids, for example, being back doing their hard physical labour after just 3 weeks. And alternatively, in the diaries and notebooks of higher ranking women, they might lie in for up to 6 weeks following a delivery. So social economics plays a good role in how long a woman was able to have to rest and recuperate after giving birth. Now, I'll just finish now with a few very brief comments about early modern attitudes to menopause. This was not quite conceptualised as a transition in the same way that the other occasions of bleeding we discussed today were, because it was marked by a gradual decline and cessation of bleeding. The first thing to note is that the term menopause, which wasn't seen in print until the late Victorian period, so it has no currency in the early modern era. Before this, then, instead, physicians used to refer to the cessation of the menses, for example. And John Friend, as you can see on the screen, wrote in his early 18th century monograph on menstruation, which was the first of its kind in England and came out in Latin in 1703 and was republished in 1729 in English in a translation. And he wrote that the menstruous purgation, or flux of blood issuing from the uterus every month, usually begins its period from the 7th septenary and terminates at the 7th, or the square of the number 7. And so you can see that we've come full circle, and we've arrived back at the 7 ages of man theory, or the 7 years being the climactical moments in a person's life. Many texts too give the age 49 as being the natural ending point for menstruation because of the prevalence of these theories. How far and in what ways women suffered from the symptoms that we now associate with menopause is not yet known, but there are extant leaflets and cases written up by doctors selling brands of their own particular pills and potions to ease women at this time in their lives. And one medical book in the later 8th century even refers to it as a time in their lives that women are taught to fear because of all the symptoms that it brings with it. And there are some records of physicians writing about flashings and things like that that we would associate with hot flushes. Mostly, though, in the personal writings associated with menopause, women see it as the end of their facility, and as we know, it gradually diminishes in the run-up to the full menopause and the perimenopausal period. And so it could be seen as unwelcome to women who haven't yet finished their families or were still in hopes of having more children, but also it might be very welcome to women who are glad to see the end of the reproductive years. Now, I've been working on attitudes and accounts of women's reproductive bleedings for more than 15 years now, all through right from my MA and doctoral research and beyond. And it's an area in which we've still got so much to discover. One of the things that adds to my excitement and renewed enthusiasm to continue working and researching in this medical humanities field is that new works are being discovered all the time, such as the example I cited earlier from my research student Katie, who has found Francis Snade's diary marking the X's each month in 1767. And if you think back to the slide that had AliceThornton's quotation on it, the picture there was from a newly discovered manuscript of hers, which was found recently and is now the subject of an AHC funding bid so that academics can study this text in further detail. And if I've excited your interest and you are minded to read a bit more, this final slide offers some options of places that you can do that. The first being my debut novel, which came out last year and is about the life and times of a midwife in 1665. And then a non-fiction book for the general public on women's lives in this era has several chapters devoted to menstruation, pregnancy and breastfeeding and things like that. And finally, of course, my academic monograph, Menstruation and the Female Body in Early Modern England. My thanks again go to all at Darwin College for extending this invitation to share my research here today as part of what promises to be a fascinating lecture series on blood. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for such an interesting and informative discourse on the interplay between the physiological, social and cultural history of transitional bleeding. This was really fascinating, and I was so glad to hear that there's a lot more still to discover at the interface of medical and social science. As Sarah said at the end of her talk, her first novel, A Gossip's Choice, was published last May. And if you've enjoyed this lecture, I strongly encourage you to read the book. To whet your appetite, let me quote a couple of reviews. One of them said, "This book is an impeccably researched and compelling book. If you're a fan of Call the Midwife, then this is a must read. Travel back to the year 1665 with the local midwife Lucy, where you'll learn all about the trials and tribulations experienced by a community midwife of that time." And another reviewer described it like this: "Pregnant with period detail, The Gossip's Choice takes us deep into the bowels of 17th century midwifery, delivering a powerful story with flashes of dark humour." We're deeply grateful to Sarah for recording her lecture and the people at Darwin College who've helped put this year's series of lectures on blood together. Of course, we've got 6 more to go. Our next speaker will be Professor Tim Pedley from here at the University of Cambridge, whose lecture is on blood in motion, the physics of blood flow. We look forward to seeing you then. Good night.